Hello and welcome back to day 28 of 30 Days to Learn Photoshop. This is the Dodge Burn Sponge Blur Sharpen and Smudge tools. My name's Ben Gribbin, and in today's lesson we're going to look at these 6 tools and how they are actually used in Photoshop. So to do that we're going to need to go to Photoshop, and let's start with the Blur tool. It's the first tool that is selected on this pane here, and the Blur tool, as it would suggest, literally blurs elements of our file, and it works just like the brush tool. We can change the brush head, we can change the strength of this, and also we can set it to sample all layers as well as a different color mode if we wanted to. So let's just show you how it works. Let's go and blur out some of our image with a soft head. The more you click, the more it blurs, and very slowly you can start to build up a very blurred part of your image. And if you wanted, you can actually set the strength of this, turn it right down, so you can do subtle blurs, focusing elements out and in, and it's a very handy tool to be able to do, especially when you work with shapes and things like that, because you can blur out the edges of them and blur colours together, all kinds of cool stuff. So that's the Blur tool. Next we've got the Sharpen tool. So this is kind of the opposite of the Blur tool. However, it actually increases contrast in the areas you paint, and it does have a kind of limit, this tool. Brush based again, can change the hardness, size, whatever you want, the shape of your brush head, and you can set the strength and the color mode, and you can also set it to protect detail, which you're going to want. But essentially what it does is it increases the contrast, which is fine up until a point when we start to see this happening down here. Before we started doing this tool, there wasn't any of this detail in here, and that's because it increases the contrast to a point where it's actually magnifying and exaggerating any kind of pieces of dust or anything we had on our image. So it does get to a point where it actually starts to add noise. So you're going to want to look out for that, because you see there we didn't really have much problem with that area of the image. It's got a little bit of like mud or whatever, but when we start adding this Sharpen tool, it contrasts and it starts to exaggerate, and eventually it gets to a point where technically it would be unusable, so it doesn't look very good. But it does help in some cases to just be able to sharpen up areas and focus them. Next we've got the Smudge tool, and this is a really cool tool. It allows you to play around with the shapes of your file. Again, it's brush based, so let's just set it to a harder brush just to show you what it does. We're going to put it onto normal mode, set the strength around 50, and you can see it allows us to actually physically drag the colours, the shapes, and just smudge, blend. It's kind of like turning your photograph or image into an oil painting, and we could literally just keep going with this, blurring objects together. We're holding down here and doing pretty decent long strokes, but if you were daubing like so, it doesn't really do very much unless you put it onto finger painting mode. Let's do that. Let's just show you what that does. You can see here it's a lot more like a kiddie's finger painting, and especially if you do little daubs, it kind of samples the colour from the area and does that. So that's the Smudge tool. Very interesting tool. You can set the strength of it, and you can use this to fade things together and just in general mess around with your images. So let's just restore that back to how it originally was. Then we've got the Dodge, Burn and Sponge tools. Now these are more related to colours. They don't affect shapes or anything like that like these tools did. So let's start off with the Dodge tool, selected by pressing O. Dodge basically means to lighten, and you can choose the actual tones you want to lighten. So let me just make a new layer and explain something very simply. In every image you have got highlights, which are basically whites, you've got midtones, which are greys, and you've got shadows, which are your darker, closer to black colours. So you've got highlights, shadows down here, and midtones. So what we can do is we can actually manipulate the colour range in our file by using this tool, and we can actually lighten any area we want to lighten. So we're using the dodge tool, we've put it to shadows, so this would be kind of the actual shadows of our file. It's a brush based tool, so let's go ahead and just lighten up some of the darker areas of our image, and you can see it changes the exposure in effect. So down here where we've got really dark elements, we can actually start painting in detail that wouldn't otherwise be there. And also it doesn't affect the rest of our image, because yes, we can do this on a broad level, we can change the entire image if we wanted to do. This just allows us to go around and paint in areas where we want more detail and create kind of really detailed images that look really good and have been tweaked till we're completely happy with them. So you can see it's done a pretty decent job of going from this, which is really dark, kind of not very much detail, to a much lighter, much more detailed element, and you can just fade it out using a softer brush head to be able to get a less obvious line, and obviously you would be more accurate when you were doing it. So that's what the dodge tool does. Very handy, especially when you're manipulating images. And its kind of cousin tool is the burn tool. This works again on shadows, highlights and midtones, except the burn tool darkens them. So let's go on to highlights. Let's say this area here is massively overexposed, which is, we can set the exposure and we can turn down, in effect, the exposure of this area. So let's just do that a little bit more neatly. You can turn the hardness up, set the setting down, and we can just paint over here, paint around the element where we want it to be darker, and it will actually change the levels for you on that area where you are painting in effect, sort of painting in detail. So if we were to go around the entire thing, do that, we would actually be able to almost correct any exposure problems we had, any areas that are blown out. You can use it on large custom images to blow areas in, highlight them, whatever you want to do. You can do it on shadows if you wanted to make your shadows darker. If your image was underexposed, you could use it to do that. So let's say down here we wanted it to be invisible, basically. Set the brush nice and big, a little bit softer, and we could just literally paint in detail or paint out detail in the case of this tool. So that's the burn tool. Literally, you can think of it as burning your image, as if it had been burnt. What effect that would have to an image, it would make it less detailed and a lot darker. Finally, we've got the sponge tool. Now the sponge tool can work two ways. It can be in desaturate or saturate modes. And you can think of this as though when you were a kid at school, if you ever did a painting with some sponges, you can do two different effects. You can actually apply colour quite heavily, quite strongly, or if you had a clean brush, clean sponge, you could suck off the colour, remove the colour, and that's what the sponge tool does, very basically. So it's actually a brush-based tool again, so you can have different shapes, different hardnesses, whatever you want, and you can set it to desaturate mode. You can actually do flow with this, which is good, because the more you go over an area, the more desaturated it gets. So let's just take out the colour from down the side here, and you can see we're actually removing any colour in our image. It's all converting to either black, a white or a grey, as though it was a black or white image, which is very interesting, and it's a cool effect. You can use it quite a lot, and you can use this to, if something was too bright, you could just tone it down a little bit. So you could just knock the tone down of an area, or you could use it to create areas of black and white, areas of colour to highlight things. However, on the flip side, let's just restore our image to the original using the history tool. Go to the original image. We can saturate our image. So this is as though the colours underneath our head are being increased in vibrancy and made a lot brighter. So let's do this down the side here. You can see instantly the orange there went basically high vis orange, and if we were to set the brush head large and paint over a larger area of our image, you can see the more and more we brush over the areas, the more the colours are coming out, the more vibrant the colours are becoming, and the more punchy an image becomes, until you get to a point where it's kind of oversaturated. But there is a fine line. You can create some really interesting effects with this, remembering that it is based on flow. So the more you paint over an area, the more and more saturated or desaturated, whichever mode you've got it on, it actually does. So what have we learned in today's lesson? Well, we've learned how and when to use the dodge, burn, smudge, sharpen and blur and sponge tools independently. So your task for the lesson is to experiment using these tools on a photograph. Next time on 30 Days to Learn Photoshop, we'll be solving problems in Photoshop. Thanks for listening.